Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Don as usual. Today, we're going to be starting off a very special series of episodes. I'm very excited to be doing this. The purpose of this series is to take a look at the book Program to Kill by Dave McGowan. It provides a sort of theory for certain things around serial killers and trafficking rings and the strategy of tension that I think are very interesting topics, but I feel that it kind of required a little bit more legwork than is available just in the book itself. So what we're really doing is like exploding the book a bit, taking a look at the different stories it tells, the different events that it recounts, and trying to piece it together ourselves with the help of some friends who are interested in very similar things. So along those lines, I've brought in a special guest for you guys today. This is Matt from Ghost Stories for the End of the World.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi, Matt. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, you guys?
Very good.
Good. Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Matt's podcast is it takes a look at these things in a way that I thought, I don't know, it just lined up very similarly with the way that I thought was like the correct way to approach it. So Matt, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your podcast and kind of things you've covered on there.
It's just a project really exploring like secret histories and stuff. Like I never really thought of myself as a conspiracy theorist until people started telling me I was one. Now I suppose I kind of have to earn that. But yeah, it's basically a show about organized crime and political corruption and how that is, shaped by like historical and economic forces, I suppose. That sounds a bit grandiose, doesn't it? But yeah.
Sounds about right to me. I mean, yeah, anytime I try to describe the kind of sort of stuff in my particular angle on it, it does end up sounding kind of similarly like, oh man, I wish there was a less like hoity-toity way to describe things, but
Sure.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
Well, whenever we talk about politics on You Can't Win, we always get to this point where, we'll be talking about the everyday kind of stuff about like, I don't know, Biden or something like that. And very quickly it gets into crime and networks and stuff like that. And like any sort of story ends up kind of resolving down into something like that anyways. So I don't know. I think it's good to get into maybe this series and stuff to kind of see what we're saying when we referred to that kind of thing or something like that, instead of just, making it a bit more concrete and also, providing some background. Now, this will be helpful for me because other than the Pizzagate is Real series and stuff like that, I don't know a lot about what are termed conspiracy theories or all this kind of stuff like, so I can be a bit more maybe an outsider on that, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah, so I'm excited. So what's the first up that we're doing for today?
Yeah, so the first thing that what we're talking about today is the Dutroux affair, which was a scandal that rocked Belgium in the 90s. It centered around this man, Marc Dutroux, who had committed various crimes involving trafficking, child abuse, kidnapping, and it implicates very high-profile people in Belgian society, and actually just European society generally. Politicians, leaders of the police, and people in high ranks in NATO even. Very, very many people ended up resigning due to this case. And it also led to a massive general strike. So that's the short story. What we're going to be doing today is telling the long story. So to that end, we're first going to take a look at Belgium and kind of asking the question, why Belgium? Why does this happen in Belgium, and why does that actually matter? So I believe Matt has prepared a little bit of a spiel on that for us. So if you want to take it away, Matt.
Yeah, so I'm going to be serving the vegetables before we can get to the the deep state tidbits kind of thing.
Sure.
But yeah, so basically what we need to sort of keep in mind as we go through this story is that Belgium is a remarkably weak state, especially by the standards of like a Western European nation. So it secedes from the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1830, and immediately it almost becomes a weird colonial project of the major powers. And if you're talking about major powers at that time, you're talking about Britain, Austria, France, Prussia, and Russia. And they basically decide what the shape of the Belgian project will take. It's home to 3 official languages. So about 65% speak Flemish or Dutch, 35% speak French. And then there's kind of a little enclave of people near Brussels that speak exclusively German. So as the state develops, the various arms of it have to cater to these different linguistic and cultural groups, which means that then political clientelism and machine politics becomes quite a big thing, patronage networks and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So in Canada, this case is, I mean, like Belgium as a case is kind of brought up a lot because Canada has Quebec, and Quebec has a lot of national aspirations of its own a lot of the time, or, this debate whether or not, like, how Canada itself can maybe forge an identity that goes beyond that binational divide and kind of, unites this stuff. So reading and learning about this kind of stuff from your notes and stuff was, I'm like, oh yeah, this is familiar to me to some extent. So maybe like in a smaller sense than Belgium, but still, like, I've seen it over the years, kind of this debate about binational unity and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, anyways, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that accords with what I've seen just from growing up in Britain, where you have this United Kingdom that is full of people or regions that fucking hate each other, really. The only thing that unifies us all is that we all just have to pay tax to the same government. But you have it's very similar sort of divides that spring up, and the fact that can in and of itself become a very useful political tool. So like, again, not to get too into the weeds on Britain, but like keeping Wales in some respects in a state of underdevelopment.
Sure.
That kind of thing. Carving off Northern Ireland from the rest of Ireland. It all becomes its own sort of power play, really. And then, of course, Britain sort of sees the utility of having a Belgian state in the end, because they realize that it'll serve as a very useful kind of buffer between France and the rest of Europe. Because another thing we have to remember is that the Napoleonic Wars are very still very fresh in the minds of a lot of the heads of states of the major powers at this time. And this sets a template for the next 150 years and right up to the present, which is Belgium effectively becomes the battleground of Europe. Anytime there's some kind of conflict that needs working out, somehow Belgium ends up becoming one of the theatres of those conflicts. And in Britain's thinking of creating it as a buffer state, we can see a kind of, what would be the term? An anticipation of what would lead to the creation of what we call the stay-behinds nowadays after World War II. And the other thing is that Belgium had very little say over any of this. So all that really mattered was how its existence affected the major players in European politics at the time.
Sure. Yeah. So just to clarify, by stay behinds, you mean the Gladio networks?
Yeah. Apologies. Yeah.
That so sort of like militia units, sort of thing that were secretive often, and were supposed to sort of theoretically fight communists if they invaded or something like that, and then were often either used or freelanced to play a role in dirty politics during the Cold War and stuff.
I think it helps to think of if you look at Italy and Belgium and how they were used during the 19th century as like buffer states in major power geopolitics. Well, that wouldn't do after World War II. You couldn't kind of condescend to them in the same way. So what you had to do is effectively, and this sounds very glib, and it is allied in a lot of sort of nuance, you had to create secret states within these public-facing states to serve as buffers against, the USSR. But, I mean, it will make more sense as we sort of roll along. But
sure,
it's the same thinking. It's just because of the historical context has changed, the way that they implement the same old policy of using different states, to act as buffers against regional enemies. That evolves with the times, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah, let me just jump in here to tie it back to some things that we've talked about previously on the podcast. So, like, if I don't know if you guys have listened to our Pizzagate is Real episodes about Epstein and stuff, we talked about the way that the U.S. government and military used the mafia in Italy to for certain purposes in World War II, kind of as like an anti-communist and anti-fascist force, something that they felt was like pretty squarely on their side, but also wasn't going to be too much of a problem later on. So that was basically the genesis of this idea of the stay behind networks, and it sort of was expanded. Almost every country in Europe has some kind of presence like this, and they're not all organized crime syndicates. Some of them are these sort of anti-democratic, anti-communist groups of various kinds. But yeah, we'll get into that a bit later, I think, when it becomes a bit more relevant.
Sure.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Italy, because Belgium and Italy very often get compared to each other because they're both relative newcomers, in terms of being powers in Europe. So yeah, they both have quite a few things in common. So they have this issue of the regions that don't really believe in the project of the state kind of thing. And the state itself struggles to sort of impose itself, on these different regions. And it struggles to establish any kind of real authority or legitimacy in the eyes of a lot of the people who live in the more neglected parts of these countries. Now, Italy doesn't quite have the same divides as Belgium, although like the Sicilian dialect and the southern dialects and whatnot have created barriers between them and the north, as has like the you could argue like the deliberate underdevelopment of parts of southern Italy as compared to the north. In Belgium, the statistics are quite interesting, and I often wonder how you even run a country that has this much kind of what would be the term? This much that has
cultural fragmentation or something.
Yeah. Cultural, linguistic. So I think I clipped this from a Politico article, but it basically says Belgium has the trappings of Western political structures, but in practice these structures are flawed and have long been so. Chris Deschauer says that the development of political corruption and clientelism is kind of a natural outgrowth of a state that can't establish its own legitimacy. So this leads to a kind of, I hesitate to say Kafka-esque, but it is kind of absurd, where they effectively have a bunch of devolved administrations that govern different parts of the country the way they see fit. And there's very little overlap or joined up thinking in how the country as a whole is run. And this extends right down to so the police, they have different small local regional police forces that all speak the language of the regions they police, and they don't really interact or work with one another all that much. Then on top of that, you've got the gendarmerie, which was kind of like the carabinieri in Italy. It's like a militarized police. The regional police forces all hate the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie hates them and kind of condescends to them. It's in turn intimately connected to the two main Belgian state security services, which are, the VSSE, which was formed a few days after the Belgian state, and the Belgian military intelligence as well. And in turn, after World War II, these groups all become intimately connected to the stay behind networks and the freelance sort of paramilitary neo-fascist underground as well in Belgium. So it's a basket case basically, and this leads to what you could call a kind of calcification of the political process, and it's becomes a very kind of slow, dull-witted state that is very slow to respond to emergencies or crises. But yeah, then on top of that, if we just loop back briefly to the early years, the British suggested that Belgium adopt a constitutional monarchy. We basically imposed that idea on them. And the role of the monarchy, as it is in Britain, it's supposed to be kind of strictly curtailed, and it's not supposed to have any real earth-shaking influence over the political system. But obviously, in practice, as in Britain, it doesn't quite play out like that. So yeah, so you have a situation where the royal family basically in Belgium plays a major role in the national bank that they had. It's the General Company of Belgium, which means that it has a kind of extra political influence. And that's much the same in Britain as well with our royal family, by virtue of the fact that they are one of the largest landowners in the country, and they have their money tied up in loads of different investment portfolios and whatnot. And then on top of that, you have to remember that this kind of extra political influence extends to people in the orbit of the monarchy. So people they do business with, people they play tennis with. If you're under their umbrella, some of their kind of legal protections and the protections that they enjoy from public scrutiny and accountability, that sort of rubs off on you as well. And in fact, as we'll see in this story, a large part of the Dutroux investigation was hampered by the fact that so many people involved had connections, direct or indirect, to elements in the aristocracy and even the royal family. So this is probably best exemplified in Belgium when King Leopold II decides that the way to unify Belgium, and he's in good company with a lot of other European heads of state at this time, the way to unify Belgium is to steal a country from Africa. That's basically how all these European states functioned in the 19th century. Anytime they faced like a crisis of legitimacy, we launch a mad dash for Africa and we steal a country or some resources from there.
Yeah.
But in his case, and this kind of explains the amount of autonomy he has, and this will help explain other things we're going to get to later. He basically sets up a non-governmental organization called the International Africa Association, which establishes the Congo Free State as a corporate fiefdom that he owns. And what follows after that is basically a Holocaust. I've seen estimates of the number of dead. The lowest is about 10 million. I've seen it go as high as 20 million. And this is done despite the fact that the Belgian political establishment is not really that interested at the time in this this adventurism, but they find themselves dragged along with it anyway. And it all speaks to this uneasy relationship between the monarchy and the aristocracy and what's supposed to be the democratically accountable state of Belgium. So yeah, and the role of the monarchy, this has been like an ongoing point of contention in Belgium, and it's debated constantly, like how much power should they have versus how much power do they have in practice anyway. And then we have a senator called Yves de Wastige, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a former member of the Belgian Constitutional Court, and they cited 4 points of democracy which the Belgian constitution lacked, and they were that the king chooses the ministers, the king is able to influence the ministers when he speaks with them about bills, projects, and nominations, the king promulgates bills, and the king must agree to any change of the constitution. So already, for a constitutional monarchy, that is quite a lot of power if your monarch decides that he doesn't just want to be a ceremonial head of state, like it's all kind of done on a gentleman's agreement that Queen Elizabeth will not actually actively intervene in British politics, but in theory she can if she wants to. So then on top of that, there's the fact that the king and by extension the aristocracy itself, as the embodiment of the state, they cannot be charged with any crimes, because to do that would be to undermine the legitimacy of the state itself. A state which is already struggling to establish legitimacy amongst the population, which kind of brings us full circle, and I hope sort of illustrates what a mindfuck Belgium is in a lot of ways, especially at this time.
Yeah.
So on top of that, we also have to remember that every single layer of Belgium's public-facing institutions, the judicial service, the police, the intelligence services, and so on and so forth, they're all subject to the same patronage network that, you know, politicians themselves are. So that also means that if there's a major investigation that's been undertaken, political sensibilities are right up there. Possibly more important than solving the crime is not offending political sensibilities, which means then that if you find yourself in a situation where a guy has been charged with, you know, kidnapping and murdering children, and now he's talking about how he's been doing it for the Belgian aristocracy and the, you know, members of the Belgian royal family, that creates a situation where you have every incentive in the world not to pursue what he's saying and not to look into it too much, because it could cost you, you know, your next promotion. It could cost you a sweet transfer that you've been chasing to a better part of the country. So yeah, and that's kind of the tangled spaghetti mess of Belgian politics.
Yeah.
You know, and then we get to the stage where basically in 1908, because of some kind of canny diplomatic skullduggery by the British state, King Leopold's excesses are exposed in the media. And even though everybody in Europe at this point is a racist, basically, it's way in excess of what you really need to do to get the job done, you know, to extract the rubber and the other minerals and resources from Congo. It horrifies a lot of the more polite elements of society. So Belgium, I wouldn't say against its will, but definitely somewhat reluctantly annexes the Congo Free State and turns it into the Belgian Congo, which then I always think about Leopold's sort of drive into Africa as being the equivalent of the guy who shows up late at a party and everybody else is drunk. And, you know, and in this analogy, Leopold would be the guy who, you know, he banged like 2K of cocaine, you know, to catch up with everybody else. So Belgium kind of taught us along, and it's still haunted by these feelings of like inadequacy, that it's not a real country, that it's only transient, and that it's liable to fall apart at any moment because of all these different cultural and linguistic and political tensions that are going on. And then World War One kind of comes along, and again, it's like an apocalyptic reaffirmation of the fact that Belgium is just the battleground of Europe. And we won't get too much into all of World War One, but you know, you have incidents like the rape of Belgium, and in the aftermath, the entire nation finds itself again kind of questioning what the purpose of the Belgian project is. So it taught us along again in the interwar period. And then finally, we get to World War II. And this is when things start to get a little bit weird, because the king of Belgium at that time basically surrenders the country without a fight. And there were huge numbers of people in his administration, his politicians, civilians in the country as well, who were, if not exactly, you know, thirsting for a war, they were more than ready to step up and fight if, you know, the occasion called for it. And he just surrenders the country straight up after trying to pursue a policy of neutrality. So this then creates a situation where you have this additional split in Belgian society between this kind of ferocious, heroic anti-Nazi resistance that's largely composed of, you know, workers, and people who'd go on to play roles in like communist organizing and stuff like that. And then the kind of business class and the industrialists and the members of the aristocracy who, if they didn't flee to Britain, actively collaborate with the Nazis. And then, yeah, we then kind of bring this kind of brings us up to the dying days of World War II. And at this point, Britain and America, like the Western allies, are already eyeing up a coming conflict with the USSR. And I mean, you can read accounts of the time where it seems pretty obvious that a lot of economic and political elites in the Allied powers in Britain and America, they always viewed World War II as a kind of unwelcome interruption to what they saw as the real conflict, which was with communist Russia. So now they're looking at the new sort of makeup of Europe and the world itself as World War II winds down. And while Germany is still kind of a heap of smouldering rubble, the British propose an idea, which is something that they got from their experiences dealing with insurgencies in Ireland and India. And what they noticed is there would be these cells of guerrilla fighters, and they would work and live and laugh and love in the local communities. And when British troops rolled in to that area, they would wait for everything to sort of settle down, and then they would switch on and activate and launch attacks from behind the lines, so to speak. And this is something that the British noticed, not just the Irish, but the Indians doing as well during various uprisings. And they kind of paid it back, with like hellfire and brimstone. But at the same time, they were sort of intrigued by this notion of armies that were invisible to the enemy, that stayed behind the lines and waited for an opportune moment to activate and start fighting against the occupying forces. So they took this to the CIA, and it's quite a funny, like the secret history of Britain and the MI6 and the CIA is MI6 suggesting horrifying ideas to the CIA running off and implementing it, and then Britain kind of tiptoeing out of the room while the CIA gets all the flack, for whatever it is that they've implemented. Mm-hmm. And this also happens at a time when the Nazis have developed a plan of their own called Operation Werwolf, which is the idea that between 100 and 150,000 of the most fanatical and dedicated Nazis will take off their uniforms, put on civilian clothes, and wait for the Allied forces to roll across Germany and Italy and all the other captured territories of the Third Reich. And then again, once the time is right, they'll activate and start a new phase of the campaign against the Allies. But the problem with this is that Otto Skorzeny, who is tasked with overseeing this operation, he realizes really quickly that Germany's fucked. Like, it's completely out of the game at this point. The German army is destroyed. So what he does is he repurposes the few operatives that he could get to go along with Werewolf, and he turns them into facilitators of the famous rat lines that help Nazis escape Germany. But people like him and Galen and other high-ranking Nazi operatives, they surrender and they offer themselves to the Allied intelligence services with a bargain, basically, which is, we have all this training as pretty skilled and pretty effective intelligence operatives. We could be useful to you in the fight against anti-communism because, let's face it, that's where the real war is now. So that then leads to Britain and America basically cutting secret deals with these Nazis to create what would become the nucleus of the European stay-behind networks. So Reinhard Gehlen in West Germany, his intelligence agency, for all intents and purposes, is the the Berlin field office of the CIA, to put it in crude terms, but it's also a key node in the developing Gladio network. And Gladio itself comes from the Italian branch of the Stay Behind. And I think just because it sounds kind of cool, that's why everybody calls the entire Stay Behind network Gladio now.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then in
But it was essentially like moving away from the using like organized criminals like the mafia and kind of creating a little bit more controllable agents, that would kind of serve a similar purpose.
Yeah, well, what's quite interesting about these networks is many of them were like very, well trained, highly skilled sort of, I guess you guys would call it black ops sort of people.
Sure.
They were well trained in like, infiltration, intelligence gathering, that kind of thing. But a lot of them were selected for their ferociousness because that would give them an in with the underworld syndicates of Europe. So, Cosa Nostra, Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, and then like the Corsican Mafia and outfits like that as well. To the point where these organized crime groups and the Gladio cells, they didn't merge exactly, but they did a lot of very profitable business with each other, which we'll get into that in a little while. But Belgium is seen as an ideal kind of location to set up a stay behind network, and I think Belgium's was called SDRA 8, but don't ask me what that stands for because it's a lot of French words, I think.
Right, yeah.
And Belgium is kind of perfect because of its geographical location, and it's interesting to think that it's the same thinking but in reverse this time. So instead of it acting as a buffer against France, now it's acting as a buffer against Russia. Just under 100 years later, and they also decide that it would make a perfect location for NATO as well. But the thing to keep in mind, to bring it back to the true network and just political corruption more broadly, we've already kind of laid out why Belgium was like a clusterfuck of factional political warfare. So now imposing this, for lack of a better term, occult structure that is the Stay Behind network on this country, it can only really lead to what it led to, because it's already a country that's it's rendered so vulnerable by all this political infighting and all these divisions and whatnot, that it basically becomes an easily manipulated plaything of the West. And sure enough, like the CIA, MI6, they start, sending their guys into the country to hook up with these Gladio networks and coordinate operations with NATO. And basically Belgium becomes possibly one of the most haunted countries in the history of human civilization after World War II, because it's it's just a ghost house. There's spooks absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
Basically, to summarize, so we have Belgium, like Italy, very weak state, always struggled to establish its own legitimacy, totters along for 100 years or so. They go into the colonial adventurism in Congo, which leads to just untold horrors and murder. Then after World War II, all of this long embedded corruption domestically and confused sense of its own national identity, I suppose, it makes it a perfect place to run and launch an operation like Gladio, or the Stay Behind network as I'll call it. And this is part of, I'm kind of singling Belgium out just because we're talking about it, but this is actually part of a kind of a pan-European project at this point, because I don't think it's very controversial to say in 2022 the Third Reich wasn't really defeated so much as the most excessive elements of it were kind of pruned back, and then the Allies saw what was left and they thought, we can work with this, like this is all right, which is how you end up with someone like Gehlen being installed as West Germany's head of intelligence. And this kind of goes for my own country as well, Britain. Like, we're very far from innocent in any of this. Gladio was effectively our idea. I mean, the CIA gets a lot of flack for it, but it was initially a suggestion of British intelligence that they form these things.
Sure. Even like to make a distinction between nations at this level almost is sort of irrelevant. Like I don't think these people really their main interests aren't like national in scope, you know. They're sort of looking out for their own family interests or their business interests, depending on, you know, what role they play. That's what they care about. They don't really care about like having their country's flag waving, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that kind of ties into, I think it was Peter Dale Scott who described this as the transnational deep state, which is this collection of elite interests that kind of transcends the traditional nation state, which is how you end up with a situation where Alan Dulles is doing business with the Nazi regime all through the 1930s, through like, you know, Sullivan and Cromwell. Then he's fighting them allegedly during World War II. Then he's cutting deals with them again in the dying days of World War II to help as many of them as he can escape, because it'll be better for not just his bottom line, but the entire class that he represents. It'll be better for their bottom line if,
for sure,
certain Nazis manage to make it out of the slaughterhouse. And then in Britain, we have Le Cercle, which began as a kind of joint French-German Catholic right-wing thing that was, for all intents and purposes, another sort of arm of Gladio. And we took it over in the 60s and transformed it into a kind of Anglo-American enterprise where it gave the Americans a sort of route in to the underground anti-communist networks in business and politics in Europe, in addition to the access that it had through NATO. And this is kind of where we find ourselves as the 1950s begin. Belgium goes through this economic boom time almost, as a lot of countries did after World War II. And these stay-behind networks, not just in Belgium, but elsewhere as well. You see the same pattern repeated in Turkey with counter-guerrilla. You see it repeated in Italy as well. They realized that the chances of an actual ground invasion by the USSR are diminishing by the day almost. It's very unlikely that there's going to be some kind of ground war in Western Europe. So what are they actually for? And they start thinking about this and they think, well, we have all this training. We have access to all these buried caches of weapons all over the place. We have all these contacts to the European security services and, you know, the ruling classes of Europe as well. We have the political protection. Why don't we get paid? You know, so that's when they start kind of running domestic operations that are designed to kind of beat back the threat of the left, because we should probably emphasize just how powerful the European communist movement, as opposed to Eurocommunism, was in the 40s and 50s. Like in Italy and Belgium, they effectively built entirely parallel structures to the normal state, and you know, ran like social services and things like that through them.
They essentially formed as a result of the Nazis and you know, the fascists in general. That was the base of resistance, and so they formed, like you said, like this almost like a shadow government underneath the occupation of the fascists.
Yeah, and they had a huge amount of it's difficult to imagine a world where this was true, but at the time after World War II, they had a huge amount of popular support because they'd played such a heroic role in defeating the Nazis and Mussolini's fascists. It was kind of like Chaz if it worked, you know, like that's if that helps sort of illustrate it.
Sure.
Chaz minus the Instagram influencers and plus effectiveness, I suppose. Like,
like especially in Italy, we keep coming back to Italy, but Italy in particular had an enormous communist movement.
Yeah. When I was last there, I went to Venice, and they still have like quite a few almost like communist social clubs where you can go in and buy a beer and just hang out kind of thing. Obviously it's a shadow of what it used to be, but it's quite, I don't know, it's quite poignant, you know, that these things still dot the landscape of what could have been, I suppose. So yeah, the stay-behinds decide to dedicate themselves first to kind of repelling and suppressing the left domestically, wherever they may be operating. So that entails going after a lot of trade unionists, socialist organizers, that kind of thing. And Tom, this kind of gets to what you were talking about with the mafia, because very often Cosa Nostra in Sicily, especially, was an incredibly effective trade unionist slaughter machine, basically, to the point where sometimes when you read accounts of their history, you wonder if they even were like an organized crime group, or if their sole job was just to murder trade unionists, because that's all they seem to do,
right?
For a lot of the time through the 50s.
They were paid very handsomely for it by the military, and
Yeah.
they were allowed to operate with military equipment. I think they were even trained by the military. And when I say the military, I mean the U.S. military.
Yeah.
Yeah. They understood the assignment, as people say on Twitter.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And then this gets into so while they're dealing with that and kind of suppressing the left, they're also using their training and their skills to start linking up with the radical fascist underground and organized crime itself, to make money and get paid. And this coincides with this economic boom that I've already mentioned, which means that these cells kind of ride a flood tide of profit by running lucrative smuggling routes, car theft rings, even pulling the odd bank job, that kind of thing, because the money's just coming cheap at this point. It's just the good times, they've hit the good times at this point. And at the same time, Belgium and Gladio in Italy, SDRA 8 and Gladio in Italy, they kind of start to pivot to this idea that if they're not going to be fighting a ground war against the Soviet Union, and if they're already sort of engaged in an ongoing suppression of the left, what they could also do is offer their services in the strategy of tension, which is something that gets talked about a lot. And that's essentially where they carry out campaigns of assassinations, kidnappings, bombings in some cases, that are all designed to kind of undermine the democratically elected state and encourage the population of whatever country they're operating in to push for a kind of right-wing authoritarian takeover of that country. And of course, if this happens, this will benefit, these industrialists and businessmen and aristocrats that we've already talked about. So some examples of what the Belgian stay behind is supposed to have got up to. 1950, they assassinate Julien Lahaut, who is the chairman of the Communist Party of Belgium. September 10th, 1973, the police discover a note from the Belgian intelligence agency that describes the planning of a coup d'etat by, and this is a quote, financial networks and far-right organizations. They name, among others, Émile Lecerf, who's the boss of the New Europe magazine, and the political protector of a guy called Francis Desson, who is the leader of the Front de la Unité, which is connected to another group we'll get into a bit called Westland New Post. There's also the Brabant Killers, which, we know about, the assassination of André Kuhls, and then there's a bunch of false flag bombings that they disguise as being perpetrated by left-wing agitators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these two groups are extremely far right, essentially on the level of a neo-Nazi kind of a group. And they're going to come up later. So just all of these players that are involved in these kinds of networks will show up later as we actually get into the Dutroux affair, as being connected to Dutroux.
Yeah. And I think also, I don't know if I've explained this well enough yet, but what we also have to remember is that as the Cold War progresses in Belgium, two states effectively develop in one country. So you have this incredibly dysfunctional public-facing government, and it's racked by infighting and administrative inertia. It can't get fucking anything done at all. And then you have, for lack of a better term, what you might call a deep state. I'm souring on those terms now, like deep state and parapolitics and stuff, but we don't have better terms, so whatever. But we have this deep state that it's composed of multiple conspiring factions that they serve various agendas that are completely at odds with the supposedly democratic system that they dwell within. And it also happens in Italy as well. P2 Masonic Lodge is probably like the most notorious form that it took in Italy, but that was just one state within a state in Italy amongst about half a dozen. I mean, don't forget you still have like 3 main mafia groups plus kind of orbiting satellite organized crime groups and other Masonic lodges as well. So yeah, basically the whole thing is a shit show. And that kind of brings us, Tom, to, I suppose, like the central part of this episode, which is because if you're a deep, what we might call a deep political actor in this environment, and you are confronted with a kind of precarious balance of like competing interests, like some form of solidarity and trust building has to develop amongst the members of this shadow state in order to ensure that it continues to dominate the public state.
Sure. Just like the mafia would have you initiated in different ways, committing some kind of crime so that they have some leverage over you. If you're operating an extra legal kind of thing like these groups are, you need to be able to ensure your agreements and your contracts with one another. You can't resort to, you can't report someone to the Better Business Bureau or something for failing to deliver on child sex slaves or drugs or whatever it is, So you have to ensure these things in other ways. Yeah.
So, I mean, you have basic business, like whether it's legal or illegal, you tip somebody off to like an upcoming stock tip or an upcoming business deal. ASCO in Belgium it's Belgian weapons manufacturer, and it has ties to a lot of figures in the country's right-wing business class and fascist underground at this time. And that becomes a kind of one of many nexus points for this meeting of figures that kind of operate behind the facade of the public-facing institutions in Belgium. And then, you also have a little bit of insider trading here. You get a few kickbacks there. You have things like the Lockheed bribery scandal. But then blackmail is also another very, very powerful tool that if you choose to use it, it will normally get you the results you want. And as the decades roll on, as the Cold War progresses, there's various like spook outfits, organized crime groups, and what Americans would call machine bosses of old, political bosses who kind of control huge numbers of votes and things like that. They all build these very detailed dossiers on various elites and members of the ruling class in Belgium to compel them to do what they want. In tandem to this, you also have this kind of aristocratic wing of the ruling class in Belgium, as in Britain and elsewhere. And they're already kind of effectively beyond the law, and they can't be arrested because they embody the state, as we said. So what do you leverage against them? Because they're not too concerned about ever being arrested or anything like that. Well, you have a class of people that only really fear disgrace or exile from their social or class or cultural groups. And then you kind of have the constellations of businessmen and, again, deep political operatives around that. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise that sex is a very powerful coercive tool in an environment like this. And the more transgressive and taboo the sex is, the more leverage it offers you as an enterprising blackmailer who's trying to get a result here. And on top of that, it also serves as a kind of a ritualized form of bonding between these members of this upper strata of society. So if everybody's implicated in something, then nobody can ever really be guilty because we've all done the same thing, And we have to loop back again and start thinking about the long form history of ruling classes and, you know, how they actually operate. This kind of taboo busting transgression is a very common practice amongst them. It's almost like a custom that's handed down from one generation to another. And it fosters this sense of entitlement amongst them that they have to kind of, you know, exploit and defile people. In a society like Belgium, this level of like corruption and depravity, it's enabled by just a hopelessly calcified political system that cannot adequately deal with this level of corruption, which then sort of brings us on to what precedent we might have for this. Like a precedent we might have for this is the Ballet Rosé affair in 1950s France, and that's where these were the pink ballets, where it was basically a sex abuse scandal that included a number of members of the French business and aristocratic elite who were caught trafficking girls as young as 14 and 15 to these countryside chateaus, where they would make them perform these weird ballet ceremonies, and then the night would end with an orgy. And this was exposed and it was confirmed. 23 people ended up being charged in relation to this, including a guy called André Le Troquier. I think that's how you pronounce it. He was charged with offences against morality. So we know that this practice goes on. So the question then is, what function would it serve in Cold War Belgium in the middle of the 20th century?
Right. And that's really what this whole series is kind of trying to explore. Like, to what extent can we say that these things exist? And based on that, like, what purpose do they serve? I think a lot of things you've brought up make a lot of sense. We'll have to kind of see as we go forward. I don't want to like presuppose the answers to those questions, but you have raised a lot of the kind of, I think, like the reasonable points, like the need for solidarity by people who are kind of above the law in other kinds of ways. You know, what would keep them together? How do you keep people in line? How do you ensure that there's an order to things?
Yeah.
There's also, I think, a sort of interesting dimension to this, which you touched on as well, the idea of this being something that's passed on generation to generation by people who are, you know, like they sort of have a different kind of existence than we do. Not all these decisions are under our control about how society moves and what happens in the world and that kind of stuff. These people, it's the opposite. You know, they make decisions. Things happen in the world. They can affect real change in the world. They can start wars. They can, create new countries even. Like they go to Africa and plant a flag and all of a sudden there's a new country that belongs to them. But the mass of people need to be kind of corralled. It's almost, the more I spend looking into this stuff, the more I tried to see it from their perspective a little bit. And it's like, we're livestock, you know, we are not on the same level as them in their eyes, you know, like we don't, even if they understand that we're humans and we're biologically similar, we have kind of maybe they understand that we have like an interior life that's similar to their own. It doesn't quite click. It's like that NPC meme, you know, where everyone's an NPC. I kind of feel like they look at us like this.
That kind of puts me in mind of two things, which is Ghislaine Maxwell, the Jeffrey Epstein's fixer, pimp, whatever. She was known to refer repeatedly to the girls that were involved in the trafficking ring as trash, as garbage. Completely had no sense of them as human beings. They were only organisms that were to be exploited, you know, for what they could get out of them. And then slightly more comedic and silly, but if you look at Prince Andrew's interview on the BBC, have you guys seen that?
I have, yeah. Yeah, that's bizarre.
It's bizarre,
yeah,
but
I saw. Yeah,
it's the complete lack of effort that he has put in to actually creating a believable story or a believable set of denials, and it's shot through with an almost acidic contempt for not just his interviewer, but for us as people watching. he doesn't need to put the effort in to coming up with convincing lies because of who he is. It's enough that he's graced us with his presence for an hour on national television. That's all. And it speaks to that idea of these people almost being alien in the way that they operate in the world and the moral framework that they operate under as well.
Yes, that's the thing I keep coming back to with this. I sort of have been thinking about this as being like a super culture. Like we speak about subcultures as, there's the broad kind of popular culture, the mass culture that defines a broad society, and then little subcultural groups, maybe some kind of ethnic like minority or whatever. You can think of like musical subcultures. With these people, I think of it as a super culture because it's a minority culture, but it's somehow also it has a stronger like determining factor over the way that everything operates in society. So it doesn't operate within the rules and within the norms and terms that are set by the broader culture. It actually sets those terms itself in certain ways. But it has its own unique operations as well.
I mean, because that kind of ties into something I think I mentioned to you, which is one of the key ways that skeptics have approached things like the Dutroux affair is to say that the ex-witnesses' descriptions of what took place at these parties in these country villas are so cartoonishly violent and over the top that they can only be the product of fantasy. They can only be the product of a delusion,
Mm-hmm.
But then consider how the Belgian state actually conducted itself in the Congo, like in the colonies when nobody was looking. And you'll find that it's very much similar. It's absolutely depraved, insane levels of ultra-violence. So if we know that they get up to that in their, colonial holdings and whatnot, then what happens when the colonies go and all they're left with is, their own country to operate in? And I think that if you know what they're capable of already, like overseas, then why is it so hard to get your head around the fact that they would do this to a bunch of, poor working class girls that they scooped off the street?
Yeah, it kind of recalls the idea that Nazism is colonialism turned in on Europe itself. People have referred to that way, the Holocaust and all that.
I was just thinking actually. I think there's quite an interesting cultural thing here, which is I think because I live in Britain, we're used to these scandals like erupting every like 2 or 3 years. So when I first heard about the Dutroux thing, I was like, yeah, of course, that makes complete sense. So it's very interesting to kind of see people from other places like react to this story. Just because like, I guess just growing up here, you just expect the worst, from...
Yeah, you guys kind of have a reputation over there.
Well, this is the other thing as well, is like, this is the only other show where I'm going to discuss this because being British and Northern, you really don't want to get a reputation as the pedo whisperer. Do you know what I mean? Like,
sure.
Yeah, I was sort of because you mentioned that about like the laws in your country about that kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, I'll sort of like I'm not going to name any names until he says it because I don't want to make things problematic for you.
They're completely insane, man. Not to like derail too much, but our libel laws are so bad. Like, there's there was somebody on Twitter, like a proper lobby account, maybe 600 followers. They retweeted an article that was critical of a celebrity we have called Rachel Riley, who has been properly like anti-Corbyn sort of campaigner.
She hosts that thing with Jimmy Carr. I've seen
countdown.
I've seen that.
Yeah, she sued this person on Twitter, and they were looking at something like 50 grand in libel damages just because they retweeted an article that was critical of her. They had said nothing themselves. Like, I think in the end she dropped the suit because like her publicist was like, "This makes you look, absolutely terrible." But yeah, that
I didn't even know you can get in trouble for a retweet. I don't know.
You think
Mate,
the
it's
person
so
that wrote the
fun.
article would be the...
I think basically the retweeter was classed as making the statement by endorsing the statement. Almost, it was a very strange argument that the judge agreed with. But yeah, in the end, she dropped the suit though. So I suppose every cloud and everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, got her point across, I suppose. All right, so let's just sum up here. I think we're coming to the end of this episode. It's kind of like a preliminary laying the groundwork for what's to come. We didn't even really touch on Dutroux yet. But to summarize, we have the state of Belgium, a extremely weak state, very fragmented politically, and dominated by various cliques that kind of vie for power and don't really have a real sense of loyalty to a central state, and instead sort of operate on a basis of like patronage and favors and stuff like that fosters a deep corruption and inability to really like do anything at the state level. Instead, it's sort of dependent on the various power brokers that head these different cliques and whatnot. So at the end of World War II, with the defeat of the Nazis and the various fascist powers, the people that were kind of more influential and powerful backers of these kinds of groups and these movements, they don't disappear. They hang around, and they are still just as useful as potent as they were. Well, maybe not quite as useful and potent, but they still have some measure of power and influence in the world and in Europe in particular. And they start to reorganize, reassess the terms, in a post-war kind of context. And they start to form what I kind of think of as these group DMs that they have. They're sort of these little groups where they make agreements with one another. They sort of determine the fate of nations and trade and whatnot, like rather important decisions that are made in private kind of small groups between themselves, and not really with any kind of democratic input whatsoever. We'll get into the specifics of all these groups as they're relevant in a future episode, probably next episode or the one after. But that kind of lays the groundwork for the retreat of Belgium from the Congo, right? So through the 50s, the kind of Belgian control over the Congo is contested somewhat, and they start to try to keep control of, in particular, the resource rich province of Katanga through the use of mercenaries. It's sort of an interesting parallel to the stay-behinds that we spoke about earlier, and that will come into play later on in Belgian history. Not in any direct sense that I'm aware of, but they just mirror one another in their organization and the sort of like the worldview that these groups had. So these mercenaries are very deep into the kind of manifest destiny sort of attitude about things, and the bringing civilization to the dark continent, that kind of standard tropes of white supremacist tropes and all that kind of stuff. That will sort of that has a natural kinship to the kind of ultra right-wing stuff that we see at play with the various stay-behinds that will be an important part of the Dutroux story going forward. So you mentioned the Ballet Roses scandal in France. That was in 1959. In 1960, there's the Congo crisis, which leads to the retreat of Belgium from the Congo, and it doesn't leave things in a good state, right? Patrice Lumumba, who was the president of the Congo at the time, he's the first president of independent Congo, is assassinated, and it leads to like a civil war that's pretty ugly between various competing like rival states inside of Congo itself for control of the country. But Belgium basically gets out of there, we'll leave off there for now, and we'll pick up with that next time, I think. So yeah, I hope you guys found that interesting. We will we'll get into the real grizzly stuff next episode. So this one was a little bit of a kind of a history lesson and laying the groundwork kind of a thing. Next episode will be a doozy where we get into some real grim stuff. So hope you're excited for that. I know I am. And yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Matt. It was nice to have you on, and yeah, thanks for listening, guys, and we'll talk to you next time. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I can't say the exact same thing. But, like, yeah, anyways, thanks, guys.
Yeah, cheers, guys. Thanks for having me on. This has been great.